Welcome to day 2 of Geneva Peace Week meets New York. Hope many of you were with us yesterday. It was really an exciting day, really a series of very dynamic conversations around enhancing cooperation between Geneva, the Geneva-based United Nations institutions, International Geneva, and New York, particularly the peace and security architecture here in New York. Something that we all recognize is needed in this tremendously difficult time. Once again, I want to thank our partners, Geneva Peace Building Platform, and the government of Switzerland, and all our partners in Geneva who have been so generous with their time in organizing this event. It's really been great. Yesterday, we discussed themes of trust, solidarity, international law. Today that continues with 2 great panels. First on human rights, this first panel promoting human rights in inclusive societies. Then we'll have a second panel on AI for peace, harnessing the complementarities between New York and Geneva, and then some excellent closing remarks. Please stay with us for this afternoon, for the whole morning. Really, again, thank you so much for coming and for being part of it. I'll turn right over to the moderator of our first panel, Florence Foster of the Quaker United Nations Office. Florence, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Adam, and welcome back to the 4th panel of Geneva Peace Week meets New York. Thanks for making it bright and early this morning. My name is Florence Foster. As Adam said, I lead on peace and disarmament at the Quaker United Nations Office in Geneva. I'm also part of the management committee of the GPP, so get to work with the lovely staff that's been organizing this alongside IPI. CUNO in Geneva, as a social justice organization, both has peace and human rights in its DNA. So unsurprisingly, we've been working on a lot of the topics that will be discussed today. I'll do a little self-promotion. There are a few flyers at the back with some fancy QR codes that will lead you directly to some of the work we've been doing. But more on setting the scene after Her Excellency's interventions this morning. We're very delighted to have you here, Ambassador Torres, Permanent Representative of Colombia to the United Nations. And so with no further ado, I will let you give your introductory remarks and then we'll lead on to the panel after that. Thank you.
Muy buenos días. Bien. Muchas gracias, Florence.
Thank you for having us.
Me honra participar en esta sesión sobre derechos humanos y el objetivo de construir sociedades inclusivas en las que todos tengamos cabida.
I'm honored to be here at this panel on human rights and the common objective of building inclusive societies where we can all fit.
Me entusiasma saber que nuestra discusión resalta la necesidad de establecer sinergias en el sistema de Naciones Unidas y de armonizar el trabajo que desarrollamos en Nueva York con la labor de nuestros pares en Ginebra.
I'm thrilled to know that this discussion points to the need of establishing synergies within and among the United Nations system and to bring harmony to the work that we are doing in New York with that of our peers in Geneva.
El planteamiento de una Colombia potencia mundial de la vida, que ha sido la principal bandera de nuestro presidente Gustavo Petro y su gobierno, implica asumir un compromiso irrevocable con la protección de los derechos humanos.
The proposal of a Colombia Potencia Mundial de la Vida, which you can translate to Colombia, a powerhouse for life, that has been the main banner of our president, Gustavo Petro, and our government, implies a commitment and a strong commitment to the protection of human rights.
La aproximación holística a los problemas que atraviesa nuestra sociedad nos ha hecho comprender que la justicia social, económica y ambiental y la elusiva paz que son objetivos primordiales de nuestra gestión, son completamente interdependientes del goce de los derechos humanos por parte de la ciudadanía.
We have a holistic approach to the problems that besiege our society. Thanks to this approach, we now comprehend that social justice, economic justice, and environmental justice, and our ever elusive peace are all objectives that are interlinked and that are interdependent with the fulfillment of human rights for all of our citizens.
Nuestra visión de los derechos humanos ya desborda los históricos marcos normativos de la tradición humanista. Hoy concebimos los derechos como un patrimonio colectivo que abarca todas las formas de vida, a las montañas, a las aguas, a los bosques y a todos los seres que los habitan. La paz, por lo tanto, también debemos hacerla con las fuentes de vida y con los territorios que sustentan nuestra existencia.
Our vision of human rights goes beyond the historical frameworks of the humanitarian tradition. We conceive human rights and rights as a collective patrimony that goes beyond only human forms of life and should protect also the mountains, the waters, the forests, and every living being that inhabits our territories. So peace is also interdependent, and we should make peace with the sources of life that allow us to live in our land and in our territories.
La acción estatal y multilateral ha tendido a soslayar la cuestión del vínculo entre las comunidades y sus territorios, más aún en el caso de los pueblos indígenas, cuya identidad está intrínsecamente ligada a su tierra. Nuestro gobierno se ha propuesto escuchar y entender las necesidades de las comunidades para construir junto a ellas las políticas públicas que harán posible un goce efectivo de sus derechos como ciudadanos.
State and multilateral action in a traditional way has made the subject of the link between communities and their territories sort of an afterthought. And in the case of the indigenous peoples, our identity is completely linked to our land. We cannot separate it. Thus, our government is now working to listen and comprehend the necessities of the communities in order to build with them together public policy that will allow for this sort of holistic comprehension of human rights.
El actual Plan Nacional de Desarrollo, que constituye la principal hoja de ruta para la acción estatal en Colombia, fue elaborado a través de una serie de diálogos regionales, vinculantes, en los que participaron millones de colombianos a lo largo y ancho del país. Solo por medio del diálogo social se pueden diseñar e implementar las transformaciones territoriales necesarias para que nuestras sociedades superen los patrones de desigualdad y exclusión que desencadenan fenómenos de violencia y para que los ciudadanos recuperen la confianza en las instituciones.
As an example, Colombia has the National Development Plan, which is renovated every 4 years. Every new government makes it. And this time, we elaborated this plan through a series of binding regional dialogues in which millions of Colombians participated throughout the country. Only through social dialogue can we design and implement the transformations that every territory needs in a different way, so that our societies can supersede the patterns of inequality and exclusion that in the end foster violence, and so that the citizens can regain trust in the institutions.
El desarrollo sostenible, el cumplimiento de los compromisos internacionales del Estado, la efectiva protección del medio ambiente y, en general, la meta última de las sociedades inclusivas dependen de la democratización de la toma de decisiones y de la descentralización del poder político y económico en cada uno de nuestros países. Así, las acciones encaminadas a lograr este cambio de paradigma serán un primer paso en la dirección correcta para promover y garantizar los derechos humanos.
Sustainable development and the accomplishment of the international commitments of our states and our countries, and the effective protection of the environment, and in general, the ultimate goal of inclusive societies depend on the democratization of decision-making and the decentralization of political power and economic power in our countries. Only this way can actions aiming to change this way of thinking are going to be a step in the right direction to promote and guarantee human rights.
Yo quiero dejarles un mensaje.
We want to leave you with a message.
Cuando sembramos, siempre las semillas se depositan y nacen de abajo hacia arriba para tener frutos. Muchas gracias.
When we plant a seed, the plant that grows from the seed always grows from the bottom and upwards. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Torres, for setting the scene and for inspiring us for the conversation to come, but more importantly, to also speak from your own truth and your own experience in your country. So thank you very much for sharing. I hope you can stay on for the session. I'm sure that some people in the audience might have questions for you, but understandably, if you can't, we're glad for the time you were able to spend with us. I think importantly, some of the links that I want to bring, also the bridge I want to make to the conversation today is this notion of economic, social, and cultural rights, hand in hand with civil and political rights, are both a normative framework, but also pathways for sustainable solutions for communities. May it be social justice, might it be things or issues based on climate justice, human rights at their center enable sustainable solutions to come to fruition. But perhaps to get to our panel here today, I'll be doing introductions ever so briefly as they come to speak. We have one speaker who will be coming to us online later on. You all have the full biographies of all of our speakers in the handouts at the front, so do have a look at them, as I'll be only doing very brief introductions. As the program suggests, the social contract between governments and their people and between groups in society is eroding. The COVID-19 pandemic has only exacerbated vertical and horizontal inequities, and the rise of right-wing governments thrive off division and exclusion. The war in the Ukraine and now the Middle East has swung the bat towards military over socioeconomic spending, and the multiplications of other forms of violence is challenging regional bodies to be able to address those adequately. You add that the ongoing challenges in delivering the 2030 agenda, climate change, new technologies, and a politically and financially challenged UN, the picture feels rather grim. You might ask why I start with that fairly dark start. Well, it's perhaps to give you the backdrop of what I hope to be a constructive and optimistic conversation with the panel. And that to propose to you that human rights, it has a transformational potential and can provide solutions to some of the challenges we have at hand. With the Summit of the Future on the horizon and the 2030 agenda in need of renewed commitment, the new agenda for peace is perhaps a galvanizing call to reimagine that social contract to build resilience by reducing vertical and horizontal inequalities, and in doing so, rebuild trust between communities and their governments with human rights at its heart. Perhaps to go down a bit down memory lane, it might be worth noting here that since the 1992 report, An Agenda for Peace by Boutros Boutros-Ghali, peace building was understood as a set of exclusively post-conflict activities in the United Nations, prevention of destructive conflict, and with it the integration of human rights and their institutions, was by and large marginalized in the UN system, despite periodic calls to change. Rectifying this historical marginalization of human rights in the UN's approach to peace has been subject of numerous agendas and reform. With the 2016 Sustaining Peace Agenda, a significant paradigm shift in that regard. It goes without saying that this doesn't come in a vacuum, this 2016 agenda, the human rights up front before it, Pathways for Peace, reports that has galvanized attention, the SG prevention agenda and with it, it's his own reforms alongside human rights, making it into the spirit of the SDGs, only to mention a few, all should be seen as driving us in that same direction. But the Sustaining Peace Agenda did shift things, and we have to build on it. Defining it as an sorry, my jet lag's kicking in this morning. Defining it as an inherently political process at all stages and all dimensions of conflict, the Sustaining Peace Agenda crucially puts root causes back in the forefront, and with it human rights, as a shared responsibility of governments and national stakeholders, and that this should flow throughout all three pillars of the United Nations. Specifically, the resolutions encouraged all member states, and particularly those engaging in the Universal Periodic Review, to consider all human rights dimensions in peace building as appropriate, which was subsequently broadened by the SG in his own reports, affirming the importance of human rights as a normative framework and as a critical foundation for peace, calling for all human rights mechanisms to be taken into consideration as tools for nationally anchored prevention mechanisms. So it was a paradigm shift from the 1992 Agenda for Peace, realigning with the vision of the UN Declaration, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as it turned 75, which first and foremost conceived human rights as a normative framework, certainly, but also as a prevention and problem-solving tool, helping both to protect individuals as well as systems of governance. Clawing back to that vision is what we're going to try to do in this panel today. With each of our panelists from their respective perspective will showcase how in their own lived experience, but also in their own expertise, human rights can help build sustainable futures. So without further ado, I will hand over to Cynthia Samuel-Olonjuwon, and apologies if I've butchered your name, please do correct me, Special Representative to the United Nations and Director of the ILO Office for the UN. And I have a couple of questions for you. They won't come as a surprise as we've talked about them before. But how can human rights in their entirety, so economic, social, and cultural rights, as well as civil and political rights, be at the heart of prevention strategies? And how has the right to work protected both individuals and fields of work to ensure that people can participate in the economic life of a country, creating positive cycles? Over to you.
Thank you very much, Florence. You didn't 100% butcher my name. So you did a good job, something like 80%, but thank you so much. And let me also thank the organizers for inviting the ILO to be part of this process. It's an area of work that we're very, very committed to. And we'll just share a few thoughts with you along the lines that you have indicated. The ambassador has made my work very easy because she's highlighted a lot of the key issues within the context of the labor rights as part of the human rights agenda, emphasizing social justice, social dialogue, and all those issues. So thank you very much, Madam Ambassador. I'll highlight three things because of the time constraints. One, it bears reiterating is that the toxic combination of the mutually reinforcing crisis, whether we're talking about violent conflict, climate change, and disasters, have staggering socioeconomic costs. And evidence shows that this is linked to unemployment and other significant decent work deficits. It's also linked, and I know there was reference to this earlier, to reduce social trust, arising from unresolved grievances that are often rooted in inequality, failure to respect human rights, and notably labor rights, exclusion, lack of participation, mechanisms, social dialogue, and very strongly the feelings of injustice. These crises can and have reversed the sustainable economic development that has been achieved in some of the countries, and they have large implications for the world of work. We have seen that these have led to rising informality and increasing precariousness of work, particularly for young people and for women. What are the impacts of this? One of the things that we have seen is that these have, should I say, expanded the room for illicit economies. And they've provided perverse incentives for continued violence. And we've seen this in many parts of the world. Before I moved to New York a couple of months ago, I was the Assistant Director General of the ILO for Africa. And these were replicated in several countries, but it goes beyond Africa. They also, we can also show from research that conflict destabilizes enterprises. And these have implications for social protection. They have implications for the respect for fundamental principles and rights at work. But more importantly, they worsen poverty, they worsen exclusion, and there's the vicious cycle of what perpetuates and provides a fertile ground for crisis, conflicts, and lack of peace. So that's the first point. The second point that I'll put on the table is that the international labor standards that have been adopted over the more than a century of the existence of the ILO, and these standards are related to the human rights instruments of the UN, but they go beyond by focusing particularly on the world of work. And they provide tried and tested solutions for resilience and stability. They lay the groundwork, and this is important, Florence, in terms of what you say, the positive, what can be done, how are we supporting the resolution or the solution to these. They go beyond the, they provide the groundwork for the establishment and maintenance of both governmental and non-governmental institutions that are necessary to establish participatory governance and to preserve human dignity. Recommendation 205 on employment and decent work for peace and resilience has helped to reinvigorate the ILO mandate in the humanitarian, development, and peace nexus. So that's the second anchor. The third one, and this also links very well with what both Florence and the ambassador have said. And the question is, what is a socially just society? And I'll respond by quoting from some of the tools of the ILO. It is a place where all human beings, and I quote, have the right to pursue both their material well-being and their spiritual development in conditions of freedom and dignity, and of economic security and equal opportunity. And if there is an essential degree of fairness in the distribution of the economic outcomes. So we're looking at this both in the context of difficult transitions, such as those related to crises and longer-term economic transformations. Such a society has to be anchored in the rule of law, including those laws and policies and initiatives that govern the world of work. In a nutshell, sustainable development and human rights, including socioeconomic and labor rights, are cornerstones for sustainable peace, by promoting social justice for all. In fact, the preamble to the Constitution of the ILO says that there's no lasting peace without social justice. And I always make bold to say that the ILO was given the Nobel Peace Prize for its pursuit of social justice. And as I end, one of the things, and that's the most recent development from the governing body meeting that took place in November, was the endorsement of the establishment of the Global Coalition on Social Justice. And a key pillar of the work would be the pursuit, along with other partners within the UN, outside of the UN, within the communities that we have here, but also looking at business, looking at member states and the trade unions to ensure that we elevate the conversation on social justice at the same level that we have on the environment and on the economy. So Florence, I'll stop here and thank you very much.
Thank you, and 5 stars for keeping to time. Cynthia will sadly have to leave us just before 10 o'clock because she has a series of urgent meetings before she goes on leave. And she'll be replaced by Mathieu Cognac, so if there's a little shuffle on my right, don't be surprised. But thank you very much. And I think one of the key things for me is that, from what you were saying, is that the how is as critical as the what. And so how we do development, how we do some of these nationally owned and nationally based progresses in developing either labor laws or other legislative processes for at the national level, is that the how is just as important as the what we are doing, and the how needs to be anchored in that notion of social justice, and so delivering for the many and not just for the few. But with no further ado, Dr. Roshni Menon. Sorry, it's the first time I call her doctor. We've been on first name basis. But you're acting director of the Inequality and Exclusion program at NYU Center on International Cooperation. And we've had a little bit of a back and forth on what you might be able to say, because her expertise is exponential. So we had to sort of pick and choose what she might be able to talk about. The one question I have for you is, how does trust affect vertical and horizontal inequalities and grievances? And where have human rights-based approaches helped address these as a preventative tool? And I know you have a few examples, and I'm looking forward to your intervention, but over to you.
Thanks very much, Florence. I think you sort of, I mean, it's a great introduction. Thank you. Also, thank you to IPI for inviting me to be a part of this panel today, and to the speakers before me for their very illuminating remarks, which I think I'll be echoing in my own remarks. I'm delighted to join this conversation. In fact, I come from an explicitly development background. So I specialize in poverty and inequality, and spent at least the beginning of my career working on the human development and capabilities approach. Though I think both are concerned with economic, social, and cultural rights as well, and freedoms as much as with civil and political rights. Meanwhile, fast forward to now, I work quite a bit on the intricate dynamics between trust, inequalities, divisive narratives, and the transformative potential of human rights-based approaches to some extent. So today I'd like to speak a bit about the relationship between trust on both vertical and horizontal inequalities, as you mentioned, and dissect a bit about how divisive narratives kind of exacerbate this growing trust polarization, and finally examine the role of human rights-based approaches in preventing conflicts, advancing social cohesion, and maybe fostering more sustainable solutions. So without delay. So given that I work for the Inequality and Exclusion team at Pathfinders at the Center on International Cooperation, I should start with an inequality fact. So 71% of the world's population lives in countries where inequality has grown. Across the global south and north, people see the stark contrast between the lives of the privileged few and the control they wield over decisions that shape the lives of the majority, and the growing number of people who are struggling to meet just their basic needs, lacking the freedom to go about their daily lives. Inequality in this sense is not inevitable, and the question of who has lost and who has won in our current system is not chance or coincidence, but based on histories of both recent and centuries-old oppression, exploitation, and divisions. So when we talk about peace and prevention of social unrest and violence, we must start from the root causes, which are nearly always the unfair and unequal distribution of resources, opportunities, and power across societies. So in fact, life is getting, I know we want to talk about solutions, but first let me lay out some of the problems. So life is getting more uncertain in most parts of the world. Many countries are now exposed to multiple and compounding levels of economic, social, environmental shock, something that Cynthia referred to. And these can intersect with underlying inequalities and vulnerabilities such that a vicious cycle of income inequality, increasing social stratification, and discontent is spreading across societies and generations. In fact, in a report that Pathfinders published last year, we found that for those countries for which complete data exists across 6 areas of crises, that's just 89 countries, at least 71 of these 89 countries, that's 80%, are at high or moderate risk of suffering from at least 3 crises at the same time. So it's no wonder that we live in a time when globally 6 in 7 people feel insecure, where even anger is on the rise. According to a recent Gallup survey on the positive and negative emotions that people feel, nearly a third of the world reported being in some form of physical pain. And around the world, it's been reported that 24 out of 28 countries are seeing all-time lows in the number of people who think their families will be better off in 5 years. So again, it should be no surprise that in many countries, trust in the government and even the UN is on the decline, and institutional leaders are seen as the least trustworthy people in society, and even autocracies in some cases are becoming more appealing to some. In fact, trust is a key element of social cohesion and social capital. It facilitates cooperation among groups and leads to not only socioeconomic benefits, but also to better psychosocial outcomes, while also contributing to public trust in governance institutions. However, trust also fluctuates over time and according to different circumstances and contexts. So I don't know if people are familiar with the Edelman Trust Barometer, but in 2023, it came out after the Russian invasion of Ukraine and a cascading number of crises. It found that the descent to distrust had created acute polarization in society. So interestingly, it was found that income-based inequalities had created 2 trust realities, with those in the top quartile of income holding a profoundly more positive view of institutions than the vast majority in the bottom quartile, potentially leading to a loss of shared identity and national purpose. So the presence of multiple crises in this political environment only serves to further drive and amplify the underlying inequalities in society, and these in turn deepen crises and increase the potential for social unrest and conflict. That's the background. Now, I have a lot more to say about divisive narratives as an amplifier of grievance, but I'm going to try and shorten it to get to the last bit. But in essence, underlying grievances are leading to a rise in perceptions of division worldwide. So for instance, the 2023 Edelman, that same trust barometer, found that the majority of people, at least 60% or more, feel that their country is more divided than ever before. That is the strength of negative feelings people have towards groups seen as othered is increasing. So our research, taken from many meetings we've held on the subject in our offices, is increasingly showing these divisions in turn are being exploited by what we call divisive entrepreneurs, who sow polarizing narratives that are adversarial in nature and exploit differences, be it based on gender, race, religion, nationality, by pitting groups against each other to sow discord and distrust, to distract, and disempower communities. There are many examples of this around the world, I could talk about it, anti-LGBTQI plus rhetoric in Costa Rica, to Islamophobic backlash in Sweden, to anti-feminist movements in South Korea. We've been tracking these different movements across the world. And this form of disinformation cultivates resentment, discontent, and an us versus them mindset. Critically, these narratives frame rights as a zero-sum game between 2 groups, emphasizing competition, scarcity, individualism, where rights for one group are perceived as a loss for another. That's disinformation. So by intentionally framing the language of rights in this way, divisive actors can position themselves as mediators or heroes, obscuring the possibility of there being shared concerns between groups and therefore mediated solutions or any sort of social dialogue. And that's what we're trying to get to. How do we get to that? So, just to cut through some of these comments, so trust must be constantly nurtured through governments, responding to citizens' concerns and tackling issues that are important to them, ensuring dialogue with different groups of people within the polity, and developing a new social contract that reimagines transformative policies premised on achieving greater social justice, strengthen solidarities, and deeper multilateralism. So in terms of how do we operationalize that? So how do we do this using a human rights-based approach, specifically sort of legislative parameters that are based in human rights norms? So in other words, what are the building blocks to preserve trust and social dialogue? I think given that I was kind of sort of outlined sort of a hopeless story, I think it's worth saying at this point that polarized narratives themselves often tell a story of societies that are sort of split in two. But in fact, the glass may be more than half full. So according to a latest Open Society Barometer, 86% of people want to live in a democracy. Just over 70% believe that human rights are a force for good, and it reflects the values that they believe in. The majority of people everywhere want leaders to bridge divides and reduce inequality. So that the desire is there. And so at Pathfinders, we've also been forwarding this idea of a three-pronged approach. So enacting visible change, strengthening social cohesion, ensuring credible governance. From a rights perspective, this entails a multi-pronged approach that seeks to operationalize human rights, values, and norms, in particular ways taking into account a country's own priorities. So let me take a minute to say what I've done. So we've been working on a just transition workshop that we ran in Indonesia, which sought to provide specific tools for senior government officials in assessing whether green transition policies can take into account the active participation and inclusion of marginalized groups in decision-making processes, while empowering local communities to take an active role in their own development. So we implemented, or we were in the process of sort of talking to senior civil society, senior government officials on distributional impact assessment tools, intersectionality-based policy analysis tools, and recognizing green transitions will inevitably cause severe disruptions that disproportionately impact workers in declining sectors, social dialogue tools which includes all types of negotiation, consultation, exchange of information, typically between representatives of government, employers, workers on issues of common interest. So these tools together ensure that there's a real understanding of the winners and losers of any big policy reform process, and they're accounted for within a structured social dialogue and conflict resolution mechanism, thereby reducing the potential for future backlash or divisive narratives. So they're very much also in line with human rights principles and ensuring public participation in decision-making processes and meaningful access to information. So that is access rights and access to the process of redress. So I should add as a final statement that the toolkit is being considered for inclusion in Indonesia's next medium-term plan, which harkens back to the importance of continually developing and strengthening legal frameworks that recognize and protect rights, whilst also implementing policies that redress economic, social, and cultural disparities. I think I'll end there.
So, thank you very much. And I hope you got most of that. I appreciate that. Roshni, you spoke really, really fast, and I hope the ambassador managed to catch at least some of the highlights of what you were sharing. But I think it's really interesting to see when we had our prep call, we speak different languages. I speak human rights language, she speaks development peace language. And it was interesting trying to find the bridges of how we're ultimately speaking about the same things, really, and trying to see which boxes we need to slightly shift to be able to fit. And I think I found it really enriching to be able to really recognize that in our call. And definitely when she gave me this example of the climate justice piece of work that she was doing in Indonesia, I was like, yes, that's a perfect example of how rights are both norms and processes. Participation in decision-making processes, access to information sort of is infused in that example that she gave. And yet it was interesting that it took a while for us to get to this is a social justice process and project that she was implementing. So just thanks a lot for that. And thanks for getting through so much substance in a relatively short time that I gave you all. Lorna, thank you for being so patient. Lorna Merekaje, and again, please correct if I butchered your name, Director of the South Sudan Democratic Engagement, Monitoring and Observation Program. It's lovely to have you. I'm really sorry you weren't able to travel to be with us. And I'm so glad you still made the time to be with us virtually. So with no further ado, please, over to you. The question I had for you was really along the same line as the question I had for Roshni, is your experience of how rights have been pathways for sustainable solutions and sustainable outcomes when it comes to peace. But I will let you, in your own experience and your own expertise, find what you would like to share with us today. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me, and my apologies for not making it. Unfortunately, I couldn't make it to be New York in person, but I'm happy to be part of this conversation. I want to start by stating that participatory governance or human rights approach has over the years become an important concept in cultivating legitimate politics and discourse around governance and partnership in national decision-making processes. Despite its complexity, it's important to note that these are processes that help to cultivate ownership, but it is processes that most importantly make stakeholders recognize the importance in the process. However, it's important to acknowledge that there can be genuine participation or false participation. I thought it's important for me to start from that perspective. I would like to say that this conversation comes at a very critical point where globally we are faced with challenges of redefining how people get to access, how people get to enjoy their rights, and more communities seem to be understanding their rights and demanding for the rights. But if you look at it closely, then sometimes it is difficult for the communities to access rights that have been agreed and rights that are obviously their rights. And I think, to me, the most important thing is then to ask the question of what could be the obstacles. And some of the few things I would like to share in this discourse or to bring to our attention is that when we talk about trust building, when we talk about peace building, or the desire to cultivate an inclusive society, there are a few things that we need to take note of. One, the legal framework. We should start looking at rights or right-based approach from a perspective of the anchor point. Where is the anchor point? And to me, I think the legal framework is very important. We need to look deeper into the legal framework and see the design and the language of different legal framework that we have. Number two is the question of institutions. What kind of institutions do we have to facilitate the desire of having an inclusive society or trust building and peace building? And institutions come in handy because then they serve as the vehicle for delivering whichever right, whether it's economic or political right. And I think for right defenders, or when designing a human right approach or human right based programs, it's important for us to look at existing institutions around. And I will share few examples towards the end, but I thought I should highlight these few points. Point number 3 is the question of mechanism. What mechanism are we using in order to achieve the inclusive society, or for us to facilitate peace building or trust building processes? And there are several mechanisms, but sometimes there's tendency to fixate in one mechanism. And by saying this, I mean to bring to our attention that there's need for us to constantly review our approach as we try to facilitate an inclusive society, so that we don't fixate at a point where we think we are delivering the required service, where we think what we are doing is right-based, but to some extent it's like the actors have deviated from the original objective. And finally, where are the stakeholders? And I think the stakeholders are a very important actor in this process. And this brings me to a topic I like so much, the question of co-creation and co-production. Where is that in peace building efforts, in development efforts, and even in governance efforts? And I think until we start looking at all that in a holistic way, then we are still missing a point. And this brings me to the question of our institutions. Are the institutions prepared enough to be able to deliver the desired results? Are our institutions designed to facilitate an inclusive society? And when we design responses, are we able to have the stakeholders participate in that? And those are all questions that are going on in my mind, But while I ask those questions, I would like to share a few examples. As an activist, I have been in this business for a very long time, and I have grown as an activist. And some of profound experiences or examples that I would like to share is the question of becoming a nation, which is still quite dear to us as South Sudanese. It was a euphoric experience, but also an exciting experience. And after having our independence, which we got through a referendum vote, some of us have sat down to ask ourselves, what was the game changer? What was the key instrument that allowed us to achieve independence? And we realized that the importance of anchoring the right for self-determination in the peace agreement was very, very important for South Sudan to be able to go through the process of referendum, but most importantly, to be able to achieve the desired results. And from that example, one of the things that as rights defenders in South Sudan, we have taken, and especially SSuDEMOP as an institution, is we have taken a keynote on the legal framework in the country. When the country is going through this reform, we have created a space for ourselves and taken it upon ourselves to ensure that the processes are people-centered and the review or the reform of the legal framework reflect the desire to facilitate access to different rights, whether it's political, economic, or human rights. And there are several examples that I have lived through. For example, when we had crisis in 2013, the country went into turmoil. The question that the citizens were asking is, where are we in all this? Because we participated in creating this country, and now it has gone into turmoil. How do we help to bring it out of the crisis? And one thing I remember profoundly as a civil society activist with my colleagues by then, through a vehicle we created, which is the Citizens for Peace and Justice, is to demand for our space at the table. So what am I saying? There needs to be space for demand, but there needs to be knowledge in order to put that demand in a very constructive way, which achieves results. So as we try to work towards an inclusive society, the question of knowledge within the stakeholders is very important. What kind of information do the stakeholders have? I know my 7 minutes are gone. I had between 5 to 7 minutes. I would like to stop by saying that these rights can be anchored. Yes, first we need to anchor the rights on a legal framework, but most importantly, we should not lose focus of the knowledge of the right among the stakeholders and how the stakeholders get to demand to be in that space. Because not unless we have stakeholders demanding their rights, we're not still having an inclusive society. Inclusion on paper is different from actual inclusion, and inclusion can never be realized unless the stakeholders participate, and they participate in a legitimate way. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lorna, and thank you for your discipline. Sorry we have so little time. I know you had much more to share, but I think your notion of meaningful participation and looking at how that's done is just as important as the intention behind it. And I think critically so, access to information and knowledge, so meaningful consent also in how we participate, not only where we participate, is critical. So thank you very much. Graeme and I will sort of tag team the last bit of it, starting with Graeme, to bring it back to New York-based institutions. Graeme's research obviously goes far beyond the parameters of New York and looks into Interpeace's own programs and where creativity around human rights and peace building has grown. And so Graeme will also be outlining some of those examples, but importantly also bringing it back to the space here and looking forward to the Summit of the Future. But Graeme, Director of Interpeace New York, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm the principal representative of Interpeace in New York and a senior peacebuilding advisor. I firstly want to thank excuse me, thank IPI and the Geneva Peacebuilding Platform for the opportunity here, but also particularly for, on this topic, not allowing this to be a conversation merely about the kind of geography of these issues across the Atlantic within this institutional set of institutional arrangements, so that we can dive much more deeply into some of the more substantive conversations about collaborative endeavor, opportunity, innovation, in the intersection between peace building and human rights, and the symbiotic relationship and learning between those two fields. I'm actually basing a lot of my comments on work that Interpeace has done in partnership with the Human Rights Institute and Clinic at the University of Colombia, and several peace building partners. So this isn't just Interpeace's practitioners, it's both a series of peace building organizations and human rights organizations, and conversations by no means exhaustive. This is not a conclusive image. We need to deepen this work at the country level in particular, but conversations with practitioners about where they see the creative potential for collaborative endeavor. And you'll see one of the reasons why I think this is so important is because actually I think that, and most of these practitioners, often who didn't self-describe as either peace builders or human rights actors, would often recognize that despite the rhetoric, the silos are very deeply entrenched at 10,000 feet inside the UN, are very often deeply entrenched in the donor discourse, which bifurcates funding despite investing both in peace building and in human rights in a way that does not incentivize the collaborative endeavor. And yet on the ground, there is incredible collaborative innovation by practitioners who often traverse the boundaries of disciplines for a whole lot of reasons. And I'm going to get to what that looks like. I do just want to say that for many of them, this conversation has been historically quite constrained by the preoccupation in this field of a concern with retrospective accountability for massive and systematic human rights violations, which is critically important. This is not a questioning of that commitment. But that, combined with the prioritization of a concern for normative compliance of states, has tended to actually narrow the space for thinking about, outside of those arenas, some of the creative ways in which the building blocks of an integrated approach to peace and justice can be constructed. And so on the one hand, there's this sort of recognition that what this has done is that's focused retrospectively rather than endeavored to occupy the space of justice as prevention, a forward-looking conversation about human rights and justice in its contribution to preventing the future of violations rather than just addressing the history of them, although both are important. And the second is a recognition that state compliance and normative frameworks often happily subsist alongside, so normative equality often subsists alongside substantive inequality, and that the difference between civil and political rights and the protection of these rights within constitutions and arrangements very often does not reflect the reality of lived experience on the ground. And I just want to reiterate the importance of the trust issue within all of this, that fundamentally this is about the construction of civic trust, and to reinforce what's already been said, that is both horizontal in building trust, respecting communities, and vertical, the civic trust in the relationship between states and societies. It's also to reiterate what was said earlier on the platform about mistrust in economic systems that exclude people. And so we really need to understand this sort of notion of trust as critical to thinking about the indivisibility of rights and what that does and what it offers us for a prevention-based approach. It demands that we reimagine the social contract in a way that moves beyond, that promotes indivisibility of these rights and a lived experience of injustice and the need to address it. It's about understanding this as collective rather than just individual rights and claims. And it's about the distinction between formal rights and substantive inequality and the rights realization gap. It demands that we are, when we think about this collaboration, we are thinking systematically, not just symptomatically, that we are thinking causally, underlying causes rather than just remedial action, and that we are thinking about the rights framework in relation to structures and institutions and the transformation of them rather than just the conduct of individuals. In short, the creative space is about how peace builders and human rights and justice actors can collaborate to move from the normative to the transformative. This also demands that we rethink a little bit the taxonomy of what we regard as the most serious violations, and that we do this by reference to the seismic impact, to good conflict and resilience analysis, the seismic impact and the risk this produces of future conflict, rather than just narrowly defined legal definition. So when I say that local practitioners were talking about collaboration, there was an amazing, and I don't have time to go into it, an amazing typology of collaboration that they drew for us. They talked about pragmatic integration, shared goals, different approaches, but the symbiotic relationship, which was about human rights actors saying no justice without peace, and peace builders saying no peace without justice. And that common goal drove a common agenda. The second was fascinating examples of strategic division of labor, whether it was about a shared understanding of how to protect civic space, or the protection of both peace builders and human rights actors who are endangered. This sort of strategic relationship between good cop, bad cop, working with governments in different ways was really very interesting and creative. The third criteria that came up was this fascinating approach of practitioners to shared platforms, coalitions and networks, which they all complained are almost always valued but never funded. And some fascinating examples about the big tent approach, which recognized that in a policy space, the voice was more effective when these organizations working on these different areas sat together in intelligent ways. Brilliant examples in the coalitions built around dealing with the relationship between counterterrorism and the protection of human rights, and the work of the special rapporteur on that. The fourth was a really interesting one, which was about sharing each other's knowledge and methodologies. The assumption is very different methodologies, and actually on the ground, practitioners were using each other's approaches. Good conflict and resilience analysis, dialogue processes being used by human rights actors, peace builders learning from the norm diffusion approaches and normative approaches of human rights actors, really innovative creativity. And the last one that was really striking was the sort of interdisciplinary or intersectional approach, which is that actually the boundaries between our fields break down for a range of reasons. Small organizations locally saying we don't specialize in these different things, we just do them all, right? It's just very pragmatic. Some organizations and practitioners saying, actually, this is very donor-driven. You want us to call ourselves human rights organizations to get in the packet of money that's human rights orientated, we'll do that, or we'll call ourselves peace builders. So often the donor discourse, actually, people would straddle that divide because it was tactical. But the really important one, and the last one on this, was this fascinating approach to intersectionality, where peace builders and human rights actors are saying, if we are true to the lived experience, the intersectional lived experience of our communities, we have to reflect that in our practice. We have to do the way people live. So I'll close with this. If that was one set of fascinating issues, and it offers this powerful tool, I think we need these voices talk about localization in this space to shake loose some of the conversations that are stuck at 10,000 feet and in the donor and UN world. There were also a number of thematic areas of work where practitioners were saying the tension between peace and justice doesn't exist. These are really creative areas where we are already collaborating powerfully. Building resilience for peace. There was this powerful approach, which is a recognition that access to justice, or the forums for resolving experiences of injustice, was absolutely critical to what made peace resilient in various contexts. The question of securitization I've raised, that both peace builders and human rights practitioners are saying an overly securitized approach to these things shuts down the civic space in which we all operate. We need to find ways to work on this together. The amazing issues of climate justice and the existential threat that both practitioners across both divides were recognizing as a common cause and one which they could not afford to be divided on because the existential threat was so fundamental to both. We've heard an enormous amount about the social, economic, and cultural rights issue. Health and human rights as a health and peace building as a rights issue and as a peace building tool. The kind of frame of reference, no peace without peace of mind, mental health and psychosocial services. Again, a common platform on which there was great operational collaboration. Corruption as a key issue driving human rights violations and responsive to human rights violations. The OECD Trust Lab illustrated that corruption at the highest level is the single greatest determinant of mistrust. And by the way, trust should always be accompanied by this notion of trustworthiness. There is legitimate mistrust of government systems that don't reflect people. And the last one is just to say, through the lens of racial justice movements, gender justice movements, generational rights and the rights realization gap for young people, all of these were arenas in which practitioners on the ground are collaborating. They have an enormous amount to teach us about this intersection that is much more than just how Geneva speaks to New York.
Thank you very much. Before I hand over to questions and answers, I'll perhaps just respond to a name drop from Adam yesterday, seeing as he challenged me to perhaps explain why I might be opinionated about the notion of a UPR for prevention as a new process, but perhaps in doing so, also acknowledging that Ambassador Simonovic mentioned the role of the PBC, and I don't want to undermine or challenge the critical role that the PBC does have in enabling prevention and supporting national prevention strategies. I think as a key linchpin in the system of the United Nations, the Peace Building Commission does have a role in supporting those conversations. However, the PBC membership is not universal, neither does it address all contexts. So perhaps that bounces back to this notion of the Universal Periodic Review that sits in Geneva and that reviews all human rights for all countries on a cyclical basis. But not to say that the UPR in and of itself can actually be the problem-solving tool for prevention strategies at the national level, but it's certainly a good starting point. And seeing it in a system of human rights treaties, special procedures, and other mechanisms to uphold and support nationally owned processes when it comes to human rights. I think there is a toolbox based in Geneva that can support some of these nationally owned prevention strategies that are being talked about. And I think importantly, looking at the Summit of the Future, I think reinventing the wheel at this stage might be throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I think a certain amount of impatience with how the system has strived to change over the last decade when it comes to putting human rights back at the center of what the UN does is potentially quite detrimental. Not to say that Geneva-based stakeholders, and I include myself in that, are always slightly on the sidelines of these conversations, and it takes a little bit of time for them to catch up. The Human Rights Council has been doing an enormous amount of work to look at its own prevention mandate. As Graeme has already alluded to, there's the tendency of looking at human rights as accountability as opposed to human rights as prevention. And the Human Rights Council has acknowledged that and has been doing quite a lot of work to look at how its own mechanisms and treaty bodies with that could perhaps do more to be peace leaning, and so New York leaning. And perhaps there's a bit of work to be done to find the middle ground of where connecting those bodies rather than integrating them might be worth doing. I won't go into many examples now. I have many of them. We've been doing quite a lot of work looking at special procedures, the Universal Periodic Review, treaty bodies, in particular, economic, social, and cultural rights, so CESC. Again, there are a few publications at the back, but also want to be guided by what you want to hear in the audience. So happily take some of your questions and guide them to our panelists. Happy to take some of them. Perhaps just to also acknowledge Mathieu Cognac has just joined us from the ILO. That was that little reshuffle that you saw earlier. I don't have any questions online, so go straight to questions on here in the audience. And I see Adam, you've got there straight in, so go ahead.
Great, thanks so much. I have a question, anybody can take it really, but I'd be keen to know what this group thinks would be a good human rights outcome at the Summit of the Future? And specifically, are there discussions about two or three things? One is any discussion about the rights of future generations rather than just the needs of them, given that it's the Summit of the Future. And really, I think most importantly, how can the summit deal with the reality of Gaza and Ukraine and not sound out of touch and say very general things when something real is happening? And I worry that the rights discourse will sound very disconnected if it stays at a high level or if it just reiterates kind of what we all know. So really, what would a successful summit look like from a rights perspective?
I think we'll take a few before going back to the panel. A few PhD questions there from Adam. Nobody else? No questions? There's one. Maggie, thank you.
Hi. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thanks to IPI and GBP for pulling us all together in the Geneva Peace Week meets New York Peace Week. Many, many thanks to the panelists here online and those that have already had to leave. Similar to Adam's question, around the Summit of the Future, there are a series of informal consultations taking place this week amongst member states on basically what should go into the zero draft for the Pact for the Future. And I think amidst general backsliding and kind of pervasive, persistent backsliding on gender equality issues, but also on human rights, this question that Adam asked is quite important. And I'm wondering, to what extent do you think, what would a useful kind of liaising between New York and Geneva-based communities look like, particularly in terms of input for this Pact for the Future? And what would it mean? Graeme, you were talking about basically how smaller organizations, local organizations, just do all the work and kind of move on from kind of siloed approaches, et cetera. If you were to take that approach to the Pact, how would you mainstream human rights so that it doesn't actually get diluted?
Any other questions? Otherwise, I'll hand it over to our panelists. Who would like to take those? So there are three questions. Rights of future generations, how do they make it into the Summit of the Future and the Pact? And how do we not sort of sound very distant or detached from realities of Gaza and Ukraine in the run-up and particularly in the Summit of the Future? And then looking at liaison between Geneva and New York and how can we feed into what's being developed currently? Very hesitant panel.
Please, go ahead.
I mean, I'm moderating, so I'll hand it over. Graeme, would you like to take some of those?
Okay, I'll give it a first shot. I mean, they're tough and provocative questions. I mean, in terms of the rights of future generations, I'm really struck by one of the things that the ambassador said, which is, and really rooted in the different relationship between indigenous communities and the environment in which they live, is almost how do we take the human out of human rights, which is not to say it's not people-centered, but it is perhaps about a real challenge in thinking about this in terms of future generations, to think about the rights of the environment, the rights of the lived and built environment as sort of self-sustained. And I think that that's really imperative. I think it's where the conversation about climate and environmental degradation meets peace and conflict in a very powerful way. And maybe there are local indigenous voices that we can really listen to in a different way around that. The second issue is that I think that the focus on future generations has to be quite wary, because I think this is where I wear my kind of youth, peace and security hat a little bit. I think there's a real danger that in the orientation to future generations, we may lose sight of young people who are, in a way, social movements at the cutting edge of justice demands, whether it's climate justice, gender justice, racial justice, gun violence, all of these issues. And the connection to these social movements is really tricky for the multilateral system. But I think there's a real danger that we have to be careful we don't think about a future generation as if there aren't young people in the present who occupy that future, the guardians of the future. And so we need to balance this sort of future orientation with the kind of the rights realization gap experienced by young people and the generational dimensions to how this plays out. And I think that would be a really important issue. And then the last thing I want to say is that, I mean, everything that the sort of, and by the way, the practitioner experience that I'm talking about included UN human rights practitioners on the ground. I mean, there was also a kind of strong sense of their practical collaboration as opposed to the kind of the silos elsewhere in the system and in HQ. But I think what was recognized in all of these things is that the country level analysis, the kind of prevention strategies at country level that we've heard talked about earlier, I think is really critical, because the politics of the possible was entirely of where these collaborations happen was completely different from context to context. It's very different in situations of ongoing conflict. And we need to recognize that Ukraine, Israel, Gaza, Ethiopia, Sudan, Myanmar, the availability of civic space and what we can do to operate on these things has to be tactically engaged because of where those conflicts are at. In fragile transitions, that space opens up a little bit. In post-conflict settings, it opens up. This is the real challenge for me of how we take this conversation into a dynamic interaction with the sustaining peace objectives of prevention focused on outbreak, continuation, escalation, recurrence, and dare I add, transmutation, changing nature of conflict. I think that forces us into a prevention conversation that has to populate the entire peace and conflict spectrum, and that at the country level, practitioners are really astute in understanding what space that there is and what that collaboration looks like. So the grave danger is not to drop a template down on this, but to really localize this conversation. And I think that should be a real priority here.
Thank you. Anybody else from the panel wants to? I'm happy to name you. I realize just that these questions are fairly specific, so I don't necessarily want to call on you. But happy for any of you to take that.
I'll sort of just make very brief comments on the first question on what's a good human rights outcome at the Summit of the Future. Now, I'm not speaking for my organization, but for myself. I think that, I mean, partly for the organization, right? What we're seeing is that inequalities as a concept is falling out of a lot of debates, of a lot of sort of forums. Like, for example, even at the World Bank's annual meetings, there was more focus on crises and less on inequality itself. And I think it's partially because inequality is quite a political topic. It's more difficult to deal with inequalities than it is to deal with, say, poverty. So it's very easy to say the bottom 40% should develop faster than the rest of the population, but it's very difficult to say actually power and resources need to be redistributed. So any kind of anything that forwards that, I think, would be a win at the Summit of the Future, because I think a lot of our issues, including violence, is rooted in inequality. So that would be number one. The second thing is that there's a huge pushback on gender rights at the minute. So anything that forwards sort of women's participation in decision-making processes, or has anything around the eradication of gender-based violence in all forms, like hate speech, online hate speech, so the new frontiers of violence against women, and financing for, say, gender equality is another one. But again, this is sort of put against the general discussion around sort of climate change financing for development. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. And particularly climate change financing has repercussions for the rights of future generations. It's really important to leverage finance for climate change issues in order to protect future generations. We understand that as a huge topic, but it shouldn't necessarily come at the expense of women who are currently alive. So, I mean, so these are the sort of the areas that we need to be pushing, I think, at the Summit for the Future, and would have human rights repercussions throughout.
I like the fact that I'm not the only one who says for the future systematically, but it should be. Go ahead.
No, thank you very much. And because I'm just took over my director who had to leave to another meeting, I'd like to take the opportunity also to thank you for the invitation, IPI, as well as the Swiss Department of Swiss Federal Department for Foreign Affairs, with which we have been collaborating very well for the past 5 years. So I'll try to also, I mean, follow up from the discussion and try to respond. I think our view is that, yes, we are discussing the fact that social justice, that peace, that political stability is highly dependent on people's access to human rights, and we fully subscribe to that. And I think that what we want to add to this message is that it's also highly dependent on labor rights, and that labor rights is not something that is being discussed in Geneva, and whereas human rights should be discussed in New York. And if there's one thing I think we would like to see at the Summit of the Future is that we address this distinction that should not be, because we cannot address human rights without addressing the 100,000 hours, I think it is, in one's life that we spend at work. Most of our lives is spent at work. Most of our days are spent at work. And so when we speak about human rights, we must speak about, you know, issues that are of direct interest to the people who are primarily concerned. And I also would like to make a reference to the Her Excellency, the Ambassador of Colombia, when she was speaking about the indigenous communities. We can draw examples from what she was saying. You know, there is ILO Convention 169 on indigenous people. This is a fundamental convention because, I mean, it's not, well, it is fundamental in the, not as part of the core conventions of the ILO, but it is an extremely important convention because it allows indigenous people to have a right to speak and to participate in discussions that are of direct reference to their land, as she was saying, and to their communities and to their countries. So these are labor rights of critical importance. I could give you other examples. Convention 182 on the abolition of child labor, which we know, unfortunately, is often the result of severe conflicts and violence. This is the only convention that has been universally ratified by ILO member states, meaning that 187 member states have ratified that convention. It is critically important. It's something that could come up in the discussion at the Summit of the Future. And to give you another example, violence and harassment at work, something that so many people suffer through, and particularly women. And here we were discussing about the importance of gender. It's very important. And so we have this new convention, the latest one, the latest standard, Convention 190, to end violence and harassment at work, which is the first international treaty, if we can say, to address this issue. So I think if there's one thing I'd like to see at the Summit of the Future is that we can address the need of future generation by understanding that their human rights and labor rights are intrinsically linked, that they're very closely linked, and that in the future we need to have the children of tomorrow, because we often say that, you know, children are leaders tomorrow, the children of tomorrow and the young people of tomorrow being more aware of their rights, of their human rights, but also of their rights at work, which is something I think fundamentally important, particularly when you consider that so many of these conflicts, so many of these protests that we are seeing throughout the world are often based on imbalance of powers, inequality, imbalances between workers and employers. And if you want to level the discussions and balance what is imbalanced, then you need to provide the ammunition to those who need it the most. In that case, future generations, and a serious ammunition that they need is their knowledge of their rights and of their rights at work. So that's my take. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mathieu. Lorna, over to you.
Thank you very much. This is a very interesting conversation, and it's really fascinating when I listen to the interventions. And in response to the questions, I may not respond to all the questions, but one thing that is going on in my mind, I'm asking myself, what is the nature of rights? And when you talk about the nature of rights, rights are never selfish. It's never about me, it's about us. So until the designers, until the decision makers, until the practitioners start looking at our intervention and our response in terms of about us rather than about me, then we will be able to be setting the right foundation for the future generation. And that then falls into the forecasting. What do we project as the situation? And I will take the example of the environment situation. You realize that, yes, when the discourse around the environmental changes and the climate change is sometimes not forward thinking. And sometimes the decisions seem to leave out the aspect of the future. And as practitioners or as decision makers, sometimes you realize that we often forget that tables could turn. So I think for me, the key takeaway is that rights are, in their nature, they're never selfish, but also rights are not exhaustive in their nature. And I like what Ambassador said. We need to look at the rights of the environment we're living in, the people who live in the environment, and those on the other side of the divide. How does this take care of their interests? And I think when we look at it holistically, you realize that the lessons we learn are able to feed into the design of future interventions. Then we'll come to realization that where we are today, there is a generation down the lane that will be at this point. How are they going to learn from our experiences, and what foundation are we leaving for them to pick up from? And for me, that futuristic thinking takes care of the future generation, because then what we are doing in itself is self-propagating and is feeding into the future. In regard to the kind of discourse and agenda, I think the bottom line is that kind of holistic thinking in the design of the agenda. I don't know if I'm really making sense with this, but I think that holistic design of the agenda then feeds or organically cultivates a conversation that looks towards the future. Until we start looking at it that way, then most of the things we are doing may be categorized to be selfish and may be categorized to be for current generation, not for future generation. It's quite a difficult balance, but practitioners and decision makers need to take note of that. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Lorna. And I guess that's part of the challenge of the Summit of the Future, an aspiration to do everything and potentially not doing all too much. So I think that's really sort of trying to grapple with the complexity of the challenge at hand that we have coming up and trying to section that into manageable and workable segments. I'm going to respond to a couple of, with some ideas rather than anything else, and then wrap up, because I realize I'm in between you and the coffee break, and Amanda behind is sort of telling me, cut it. So I'll try to be short. Just in terms of the reality of Gaza, Ukraine, and many other complex situations, I think the challenge is also not just to feel like you're out of touch, but to also adequately being able to create narratives of change, right? At the moment, and rightly so, the response to Gaza and Ukraine is crisis management and trying to reduce the worst harm and reacting to the horrors that we see on screen day in and day out. I think one of the powers of being able to have a human rights-based approach or taking that step back is the transformational potential of the root causes. Because currently we're tinkering at the seams. We're not actually finding solutions for the next 25 years. We're trying to find a solution for tomorrow. And I think being able to do that and looking at where are the root causes of the situations that we have at hand today to be able to transform them into sustainable peace. And I think as Graeme was saying as well, is is looking at that as an iterative process. Those conflicts will not likely recur in the exact same way they did yesterday or today, and they're likely to transform if those root causes are not addressed adequately. And that's where human rights become a tool to be able to do exactly that. And I think that's really important. So going beyond the particularities of Gaza, Ukraine, Ethiopia, and I can add quite a few more, I think we need to be able to be mindful of the fact that we have failed to actually address root causes, and we're part of the problem as it perpetuates itself by tinkering at the seams of some of these situations. On Geneva and New York linkages, I mean, Maggie, you and I have worked, oh, she's gone. So I'm looking at us. She's already at the coffee. So, you know, well, Maggie and I worked when the peace building architecture review processes 5 years ago were sort of setting up and getting in motion. And we have in Geneva the same sense of sort of the recurring marginalization of the Geneva spaces. And some of that is because even in New York, you don't quite know what's going to come up with the Summit of the Future or where the entry points are. But I think the first step is actually being able to have clarity on what that process is and managing expectations of where people have voice. So going back to some of the things that were said at the panel, meaningful participation comes also down to meaningful information and managing those expectations as to where we might have voice from a Geneva perspective. It is really unclear what that looks like for Geneva stakeholders. And I speak here particularly for civil society who wishes to have a say, who's building galvanized to have a say through some of the consultations that we've co-facilitated, and who has expectations that they might land some of the language into the text that's coming up. But I think there are many unknowns, and arguably, you know, if it's the blind leading the blind, then that might need to be said as well. So perhaps that's one thing that needs to come before we even think about what are the linkages between Geneva and New York leading up to the summit, is what is the actual process? Where are the entry points for whom? And I think some of the work that was done in the Peace Building Architecture Review in 2020, that I still have that graph that was shown to all of us as civil society with the tracks and like, here you can input, here's what's going to be taken up. It looked like a really childish way to explain to us where we might have a voice, but it was really useful for me to then go to actors in Geneva to say, here's the deadline, this is what you can expect, this is the conversation that's going to come out of it. And that's currently not existing for the Summit of the Future. So that would be my first call, is clarity of process and managing expectations. But I will close because otherwise Amanda will lynch me as I get out. So thank you very much for all your interventions today. Thank you, Lorna, for joining online. And again, sorry you weren't able to travel to join us in the coffee break, but please join me in thanking all our panelists today, and a happy coffee break.